These colorful ornaments are a quick and easy turning project you can get done in time for Christmas. One of the most interesting features of this ornament is the brass ferrule at the top of the ornament. That brass ferrule is simply a piece of 7/16 outside diameter brass tubing. It's got a 14 thousandths wall thickness. I just picked this up at my local hardware store. You can buy it a couple of feet at a time. I've cut this off to about 4 inches in length, and I'm going to mount it in my chuck. I've removed the jaws of my chuck, so I'm just using the base jaws. Install the brass tubing into the chuck and let it protrude about an inch from the face of the chuck. Then just light pressure so as to hold the tubing tightly but not distort the shape. With the tubing mounted securely in the chuck, I use a pair of calipers to mark the length, ½ inch, of the tubing with a pencil. Adjust my tool rest close to the chuck, rotate it by hand to make sure that it's not touching the chuck. Then I can switch the lathe on and transfer my pencil line all the way around the piece. With the length marked, I can use a 1/16 inch thin parting tool to carefully cut the length to a ½ inch. Just right on my line. The brass is soft. The high-speed steel tool will do the cutting. Just apply light pressure. Let the tool do the work. I'm turning this at about 1,000 RPMs. As you come close to parting the tubing off, you can tell that the sound changes. Just continue with light, even pressure, and the ring usually pops off. Usually this little foil edge will just tear off. Now you could use a little bit of sandpaper to clean that up. I recommend making a lot of these ferrules at one time. Cut them up, store them in a container like this, and it's really helpful if you're making a tree full of ornaments. I've remounted the #1 style jaws to my chuck. I can use those to grip the 1 3/8 square by 3 3/4 basswood blank for the ornament. Simply scroll the jaws out, placing the blank inside, and tighten. Adjust the tool rest. Again, close to the chuck. Then rotate by hand to ensure that it's not touching. Begin turning with a spindle roughing gouge, just roughing the end of the blank down to a cylinder. Using care up next to the jaws of the chuck. Checking your progress on the reverse side. That's a smooth cylinder. Now I'll switch to a parting tool, create a tenon about 1 inch in diameter here. And about 3/8 of an inch long. Now I'll remove the piece from the chuck and grip it with the tenon I just created. With the blank secured in the chuck, gripping on the tenon I just created, I can finish turning the blank into a cylinder using my spindle roughing gouge. That feels nice. Now I'll use my skew chisel to square the end. Then I can lay the skew flat using the point of it as a scraper to create just a small dimple. With that hole created, I can now use a number 67 drill bit. You can hold this bit by hand or use this, a pin vise. They're available at a lot of hardware stores, and they just have several small collets to hold miniature drill bits like this. Makes it very easy to hold the drill bit by hand, put it into the dimple, and quickly drill a hole about 3/8 of an inch deep. Trying to do that with a chuck mounted in the tailstock would be very difficult and would likely break the bit. With the end of the blank finished, I'll now use a gauge to mark the lengths. This gauge is simply a thin piece of scrap which I've cut a notch into to hook over the end of the blank, and a couple of notches at my critical dimensions. 1/2 inch for the length of my tenon, 1 3/8 from the end is the high point center of the bulb, and 3 inches from the end is the final length. With the lathe running, I can lay this on the tool rest, hook it over the end of the piece, and use a pencil in each notch to create my layout lines. This is very helpful if you're making several ornaments. Saves a lot of time. With my lines established, I can now part the tenon on the end to mount the brass piece. I've used my calipers to carefully measure the inside diameter of my brass tubing. Then I've added just a fraction to make up for any errors that I might make. I can use it in conjunction with the parting tool to establish the correct diameter. Once I have the diameter established, I can finish making the rest of the tenon the same diameter. And now I'll just use the tool back and forth with a couple of light passes to smooth everything up. Now I can test fit the brass. That's perfect. It goes on about 1/3 of the way. It's a little snug. From there, I'll just use a scrap block to press it the rest of the way on. Now I've also found that it's helpful to color the end of this with just a black felt tip marker. Prevents any dye from penetrating and just finishes up the end of the piece. Now I'll use my skew chisel to shape this half of the bulb from my center line down towards the brass, just making light cuts. Using only the heel of the skew or the lower corner. Rolling and raising. If you're having difficulty making this cut with the skew, you can try using a spindle detail gouge. However, the skew will yield the smoothest cut and require the least amount of sanding. Keep your cuts light. Working from my pencil line. And a nice smooth curve all the way down to the brass. If you do happen to touch the brass with your tool, it won't harm it. The brass is soft. Just as we were able to use our parting tool to cut it, the sharp tool steel won't be damaged. With the top portion of the ornament shaped, I'll use a parting tool, parting on my end line, the very length of the ornament. And I'll part this down to about a 1/2 inch diameter. I want to part it small enough so that I can shape the ornament, but still leave enough mass to support the ornament while cutting. Flip the skew over, using the lower corner again. Make light cuts to shape this section of the ornament. If you hear some chatter noise like that, stop and make a lighter cut. Come back and then finish the cut. Ensure that the curve is smooth. And you may find now that you need to use your parting tool to part down a little bit further. And then use the skew to finish shaping the point. Using light cuts. Because I have so little support for this, I can't touch this upper portion anymore. I can only work on the very lower portion. But I can make light cuts and shape the majority of the point. Once I finish shaping, I'll use sandpaper to smooth out any imperfections. I start with 220 grit and work my way up to 600. And I even use my finger underneath for a little added support to counterbalance any pressure I'm placing on the ornament. And if you'd like to polish up the brass a little bit, you can use the 400 just to remove any minor imperfections in the surface and to shine it. Use your fingers to stabilize the ornament and prevent breaking it. And then finish with 600. With the ornament sanded, I'll now use my parting tool to further reduce the diameter down here at the end. And then my skew chisel to shape the point as much as possible. And if you're careful, you can simply hold the ornament with your left hand, use your right hand to separate. With the ornament turned, just use a X-Acto knife or utility knife to pare away any material down at the tip. Finish shaping it to a nice point. Once it's shaped appropriately, a little bit of 400 and 600 grit paper to remove any tool marks down at the tip and provide a very finished tip. The eyelet or screw eye it's a number 217.5 from National Hardware. They're available at a lot of Ace and True Value hardware stores. It's a very small brass screw eye. The package recommends drilling a 64th inch hole. I found the number 67 to be a little more appropriate. Simply hold it with your fingers, turn the ornament, and with a couple of turns, it'll screw right in. I like to turn several Christmas ornaments at one time. They make great gifts, and you can choose to use a lot of different variety of colors and shapes. If you're turning one and the shape changes just a little bit, that's all right. Here you can see several of them that I've done. The shapes are a little bit different on each one, but they look beautiful still. And then in terms of finishing them, you can use clear finishes. You can use a variety of different woods. Just bearing in mind the weight that they're going to have on the tree there, but you could use a variety of different woods and finish those with a clear finish, or you could choose to use the basswood as I did and use a dye to put some vibrant colors in there. Dyes, you have a couple options. You can go with a water-based dye. Water-based dyes are very, very easy to apply. You just dip them in, wipe them off. Very, very easy. You just follow directions on the can. Those are available at a lot of home centers. I like using, it's an industrial acetone-based dye by M.L. Campbell. It's called a microtone dye. Available at some specialty paint suppliers, and it works pretty easily, but it's a little more difficult to come by. You have to buy it in larger quantities, and it's not quite as widely available as the water-based, but it gives a little more vibrant color, I think. And then in terms of finishing, you can either dip or spray on a clear finish to provide some shine and years of protection.